The off-grid eccentric. Arthur Penhaligon perched precariously on his corrugated iron roof, a rusty wrench clutched in his hand, humming a tune that sounded suspiciously like "Here Comes the Sun," played on a kazoo. The array of solar panels before him gleamed, a patchwork quilt of obsidian squares soaking up the morning rays. He tightened a bolt, muttering, "Gotta keep you beauties purring. Town's electricity grid is about as reliable as a politician's promise." Below, Harmony Glades was stirring. Lawnmowers whined, sprinklers hissed, and the air filled with the saccharine scent of freshly cut grass, a symphony of suburbia that Arthur usually managed to tune out. He preferred the whir of his wind turbine, the gentle splash of rainwater collecting in his cistern, and the contented clucking of his chickens. He scrambled down the ladder with surprising agility for a man his age, landing with a soft thump on the overgrown lawn. His overalls, splattered with grease and bearing the faint aroma of compost, were as much a part of him as his spectacles perched perpetually on the tip of his nose. Arthur's days followed a rhythm dictated not by clocks but by the sun and the seasons. He spent his mornings tending his vegetable garden, a riot of heirloom tomatoes, climbing beans, and leafy greens. His afternoons were dedicated to tinkering, modifying his rainwater harvesting system, fine-tuning his homemade biodiesel generator, or experimenting with new ways to insulate his house using recycled materials. Evenings were spent reading by the warm glow of his meticulously crafted LED lamps, the silence broken only by the crackling fire in his wood-burning stove. He ate a breakfast of scrambled duck eggs and homegrown spinach, washed down with dandelion tea. He then collected the morning's yield from his hen house. "Good morning, ladies," he greeted his flock, scattering a handful of sunflower seeds. They responded with a chorus of clucks and pecks. He meticulously recorded the egg count in a weathered notebook, another data point in his ongoing quest for self-sufficiency. Inside his cluttered living room, sunlight streamed through the dusty windows, illuminating a collection of eccentric gadgets and half-finished inventions. Wires snaked across the floor, competing for space with stacks of books on renewable energy and sustainable living. On one wall, partially obscured by a hanging macrame planter, was a framed certificate. Only the words, "Penhaligon Energy," were clearly visible beneath a darkened, official-looking seal. He paused, noticing a drip from the kitchen faucet. "Blast," he muttered, reaching for his toolbox. Another adventure in plumbing awaits. He attacked the leaky faucet with gusto, humming his off-key tune. The water gurgled and sputtered, then fell silent. A triumphant grin spread across his face. Victory! But the victory was short-lived. A persistent buzzing sound drew his attention. He followed the noise to his back porch, where a small drone hovered, its camera lens glinting in the sunlight. Arthur frowned. He hadn't seen one of those contraptions around Harmony Glades before. It felt intrusive. He waved his hand dismissively, hoping it would go away. But it remained hovering, a silent, mechanical eye watching him. A knot of unease tightened in his stomach. Something about that drone felt distinctly unsettling. Violation notice, unsightly panels. The "whereas" blurred across Beatrice Kravitz's vision, each clause a skirmish won in her personal crusade against suburban disorder. The laser printer word, ejecting its cargo of conflict, violation notice, unattractive solar array. Beatrice adjusted her glasses, scrutinizing the carefully constructed arguments. She dedicated her morning to composing it, relishing each precise phrase. Unsightly. Damaging to neighborhood values. A blatant disregard for Article 4, Section B, Paragraph 7, Subsection 3. She straightened her shoulders. This was vital work. Upholding community standards was an unglamorous job, but someone had to champion the cause. Outside, Arthur Penhaligon battled a bulky spigot, its insistent plink, plink, plink a maddening rhythm against the distant buzz of a drone. He squinted skyward. The contraption was growing audacious, hovering just beyond the fringe of trees. He tightened his grip on the wrench, a feeling of unease coiling in his gut. A sharp knock reverberated through the house. Arthur sighed, abandoning the leaky faucet. He wiped his soiled hands on his jeans and opened the door onto Beatrice Kravitz, an embodiment of disapproval. She brandished the printed notice like a declaration of war. "Mr. Penhaligon," she announced, her tone sharp and unwavering. "I'm delivering a formal violation from the Homeowners Association." Arthur arched a brow. "Morning, Mrs. Kravitz. What seems to be the issue?" He already suspected. Beatrice shoved the notice forward. "Your addition. The solar panels. They are simply unacceptable." Arthur accepted the document, skimmed the jargon-laden text, and returned it. "I understand, Mrs. Kravitz. However, as previously mentioned, these panels are indispensable. I'm energy independent." "Energy independent?" Beatrice scoffed, her voice jumping an octave. "That's perfectly fine for backwoods hermits. But this is Harmony Glade, Mr. Penhaligon. We maintain appearances. We have rules." She gestured vaguely towards the roof. "Those things are a blight on the landscape. They mar the curb appeal." "They supply my electricity," Arthur replied steadily. "I'm not connected to the grid. I sustain myself." He nodded towards his tidy vegetable patch. "Like my garden. Everything I need, I provide." A flush crept up Beatrice's neck. "That's beside the point. The point is, you can't just operate outside the established norms. We have regulations for a purpose. Imagine if everyone decided to dwell in ramshackle huts and cultivate root vegetables. What would become of us?" "I hardly live in a ramshackle hut, Mrs. Kravitz," Arthur countered, a hard edge entering his tone. "And I'm an asset to the community. I'm not taxing the power grid, and I'm minimizing my impact on the environment." Beatrice crossed her arms, her lips pursed into a rigid line. "The association demands complete compliance within 30 days. Failure to dismantle the panels will trigger further measures. Financial penalties, legal action. We are taking this very seriously, Mr. Penhaligon." "Understood," Arthur responded, his eyes locked on hers. "But the panels remain." Beatrice's gaze sharpened. She hadn't anticipated such defiance. "We shall see," she retorted, pivoting sharply. "We shall see." She strode back to her immaculate minivan, the violation notice no longer a shield, but a banner of conflict. As she departed, Arthur watched her go, the drone still circling high above, a silent, mechanical witness. The dripping faucet faded from his thoughts. The real battle, he knew, had just begun. Neighborhood whispers. Beatrice Kravitz pursed her lips, a tiny tick appearing near the corner of her mouth as she marched up Arthur Penhaligon's driveway. The perfectly manicured lawn, a vibrant green against the beige conformity of the other houses, only irritated her further. She clutched the violation notice, its crisp edges digging into her palm. It was the third one this month, and frankly, she was starting to enjoy delivering them. "He thinks he's above the rules," she muttered, the words a low hum beneath the cicada's drone. She could already picture the smug look on his face. Well, not today. Today, the HOA meant business. Later that afternoon, gathered around Mrs. Higgins' floral print patio set with 3 other zealous HOA members, Beatrice rehashed the encounter. "He barely even looked at me. Just took the notice and went back inside, like I was delivering the morning paper. Such blatant disregard." Mrs. Higgins, whose garden gnomes were meticulously positioned according to some obscure feng shui principle, tooted sympathetically. "It's the principle, Beatrice. If we let one person flaunt the regulations, where does it end? Next thing you know, people will be painting their houses purple and letting their lawns turn into weed farms." A new wave of anxiety washed over Arthur as he unfolded the letter. It wasn't the typical passive-aggressive note he'd come to expect from Beatrice. This was official, drafted on legal letterhead, and the carefully chosen words dripped with veiled threats. The HOA's lawyer was requesting a meeting to discuss the potential legal ramifications of his continued non-compliance, and the implied costs of litigation were enough to make his stomach churn. He ran a hand through his already disheveled hair, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. He wasn't just fighting for his solar panels anymore, he was fighting to protect his financial security. The power company was still under wraps, he needed to find a way to buy more time. Across the street, Sarah Chen sat at her desk, ostensibly working on a story about urban farming. But her attention kept drifting to Arthur's house. She'd noticed the parade of meticulously dressed women marching up his driveway, the grim expressions they wore. Today, she'd seen Arthur retrieve the letter, his shoulders slumping slightly as he read. There was a quiet dignity about him, an air of calm amidst the escalating conflict. He didn't yell or gesticulate wildly, as many in his situation might. He simply stood there, absorbing the blow, before retreating into his house. Sarah zoomed in with her camera, capturing a close-up of the letterhead. Sterling and Finch, she murmured, recognizing the name of the HOA's legal firm. Something about the whole situation felt off, a David and Goliath battle playing out in the sterile landscape of suburban conformity. She glanced at the solar panels glinting in the afternoon sun. They were sleek and modern, a silent testament to Arthur's commitment to renewable energy. A perfectly reasonable thing, in her opinion. Why all the fuss? A seed of curiosity had been planted. Sarah closed her laptop, a different story taking shape in her mind. This wasn't just a neighborhood squabble, it felt like something more. Something worth digging into. She stood up, a determined glint in her eyes. Time to pay Mr. Penhaligon a visit. A secret revealed. The delicate teacup trembled in Arthur's grasp as he replayed the morning's skirmish. A barrage of legal threats from the HOA, their demand, immediate removal of his solar panels, had left him reeling. Each precisely worded phrase had chipped away at his composure. He needed to confide in someone, and Sarah, known for her level-headedness and probing mind, felt like the only safe haven. "They're threatening to sue," he blurted, the words spilling out before he could fully compose himself. Sarah's brow furrowed with concern as sunlight painted the kitchen in warm hues, accentuating the fret lines around his eyes. He took a fortifying swallow of Earl Grey, its familiar fragrance offering scant solace. "That's intense," Sarah observed, swirling her tea. "But surely, Arthur, there's a solution. A variance, some kind of middle ground." He released a sigh, a gust of pent-up frustration. "It's more than just stubbornness, Sarah. It feels targeted." A pause, a breath held before the plunge. "Because I'm the principal owner of Penhaligon Energy." Sarah's reaction was immediate. She choked, sputtering. "You what now? Arthur, you control a major energy provider." Her cup hit the table with a small thud, disbelief etched on her face. "Seriously? This is some kind of elaborate joke." He raked a hand through his thinning hair, a familiar gesture of exasperation. "I wish it were. The situation is tangled. My grandfather founded it, built it from scratch. It passed to me. But I never craved the limelight, the corporate grind. So, I delegated the daily operations, the public image, everything to the board." Sarah's gaze sharpened, suspicion clouding her features. "Arthur, you ferment small-batch kombucha in your basement and are obsessive about achieving the platonic ideal of a garden tomato. You don't exactly scream energy tycoon." A weak smile flickered across his face. "I know, right? It sounds preposterous. But it's the truth. Consider this, why the zeal for renewable sources? Why the constant fretting about grid infrastructure?" He gestured around the sun-drenched kitchen, indicating the energy-efficient appliances, the discrete solar charging ports seamlessly integrated into the windowsill. "This isn't a passing fancy, Sarah. It's ingrained." He leaned closer, lowering his voice to a near whisper. Remember last month's blackout? They blamed a faulty transformer. But I discovered they were diverting power to that new data center across town. I fought it, but the board, they only saw dollar signs. A shudder ran through him, the memory leaving a bitter taste. Doubt still lingered in Sarah's eyes, but a seed of possibility had been planted. All right, let's entertain this hypothetical. If you truly wield this immense corporate power, why haven't you quashed the HOA's ridiculous lawsuit? Because, Arthur confessed, a note of weariness creeping into his voice, revealing my involvement would be a disaster. It would unleash chaos. The media frenzy, the shareholder uproar, the sheer logistical nightmare of everything. And besides, his eyes met hers, a plea for understanding. They'd know exactly how to get to me. Like, confiscating my solar panels. He offered a mirthless chuckle. The irony is almost unbearable. Digging for the truth. Sarah stared at the email from the HOA, then back at Arthur's defiant grin, a knot of unease tightening in her stomach. His casual claim, that he owned Penhaligon Energy, felt absurd, yet the sheer audacity of it piqued her curiosity. She decided to dig. First, the internet. A basic search for Penhaligon Energy yielded a sleek website filled with greenwashing buzzwords like sustainable solutions and eco-conscious initiatives. No mention of Arthur Penhaligon. A deeper dive through corporate filings turned up a labyrinthine structure of holding companies, each more opaque than the last. Frustrated, Sarah abandoned her laptop and headed for the local library. The hushed atmosphere of the genealogy section was a welcome change. Armed with Arthur's name and a hunch, she spent hours poring over dusty directories and microfiche records. Birth certificates, property deeds, old newspaper articles, a tangled web of local history unfolded before her eyes. Still, no direct link to Penhaligon Energy. Discouraged but not defeated, Sarah took a break, grabbing a lukewarm coffee from the library's vending machine. As she sipped, she overheard two elderly women gossiping about the town's history. One mentioned the Penhaligon family, their rise to prominence, and a scandal involving a local factory polluting the river decades ago. An idea sparked. Sarah approached them, introduced herself, and cautiously steered the conversation towards Penhaligon Energy. "Oh, that's old man Hemming's company, isn't it?" one woman said, adjusting her spectacles. "Though I heard whispers that young Arthur was involved somehow, even back then. Quietly pulling the strings, they said." Emboldened, Sarah followed up, asking if they knew anyone who had worked at Penhaligon Energy. They mentioned a retired mechanic named George who lived just outside of town. The next morning, Sarah found George tinkering with an old Ford truck in his driveway. He was reluctant to talk at first, his eyes guarded, but Sarah's genuine interest and persistent questioning eventually chipped away at his reserve. Penhaligon Energy wasn't always ethical, George admitted, wiping grease from his hands. Arthur, he was just a kid then, but he had a way of getting what he wanted. Old Hemmings, he listened to Arthur more than anyone else. George revealed how Arthur, even as a teenager, had been instrumental in pushing for cost-cutting measures that ultimately led to environmental violations. He spoke of secret meetings, backroom deals, and a general atmosphere of fear and intimidation. Sarah thanked George and drove back to town, her mind racing. She needed concrete proof. Recalling George's mention of Hemmings, Sarah returned to the county records office. This time, she focused on Hemmings' estate filings. After hours of searching, she found it, a document transferring Hemmings' controlling shares of Penhaligon Energy to a trust. And the beneficiary of that trust? Arthur Penhaligon. The document was meticulously filed, legally sound, and undeniable. Arthur Penhaligon owned the power company. The smug look on his face when he announced it suddenly made perfect, sinister sense. The game had changed. The lawsuit. Beatrice Kravitz practically vibrated with restrained glee as she addressed the HOA meeting. The fluorescent lights of the community hall hummed, a dull counterpoint to the buzzing excitement she felt. As you know, she began, her voice dripping with saccharine sweetness, we've been attempting to resolve the matter of the unauthorized additions to Mr. Penhaligon's property through polite channels. A ripple of murmurs went through the assembled residents, mostly retired and eager for drama. Unfortunately, Beatrice continued, drawing the word out, Mr. Penhaligon has remained uncooperative. Therefore, after consulting with our legal counsel, the board has decided to pursue a lawsuit demanding the immediate removal of the offending solar panels. She paused for effect, letting the word lawsuit hang in the air like a particularly potent air freshener. A few gasps echoed through the room, followed by a smattering of applause. Beatrice beamed, basking in the collective approval. The lawsuit arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered by a bored-looking process server who shoved the packet into Arthur's hands without making eye contact. Arthur stood on his porch, the crisp legal documents heavy in his hands, the morning sun reflecting off the polished brass of his weather vane. He watched the server's car disappear down the street. He was used to dealing with numbers, not lawyers. The amount of work, the expense, the sheer hassle of fighting this, it was daunting. He ran a hand through his already disheveled hair. He'd budgeted for upgrades, for expansion, not for legal battles. But as he turned and went inside, the quiet determination on his face spoke of a resolve that had been hardening since the first violation notice. He wouldn't back down. This wasn't just about solar panels anymore. Sarah Chen watched the unfolding drama from the sidelines, a knot of unease tightening in her stomach. She'd seen the violation notices tacked to Arthur's door, the clipped exchanges between him and Mrs. Kravitz, the general air of simmering animosity that hung over the neighborhood. At first, she dismissed it as just another HOA squabble, the kind that erupted with predictable regularity in suburban enclaves. But then she saw Arthur, standing on his porch, holding the lawsuit papers, his shoulders squared, his gaze fixed on something unseen in the distance. There was something in his posture, a quiet strength that intrigued her. She'd seen him working on those panels, meticulously adjusting angles, running calculations, a genuine passion in his eyes. This wasn't about some aesthetic violation, it was about something more. The David versus Goliath narrative was taking shape in her mind. Most people wouldn't fight City Hall, but something told her that Arthur Penhaligon was not most people, and she had a feeling that there was a great story buried just beneath the surface of this ordinary suburban conflict. She felt the familiar itch of a journalist sniffing out a lead, a sense that this seemingly trivial dispute had the potential to expose something much larger about power, control, and the lengths people would go to protect their little patch of green. Showdown at Harmony Glades. The best defense is a good offense, Arthur, Saul Bergman, Arthur's lawyer, said, adjusting his tie. Sunlight glinted off his bald head. They're suing you for violating some arcane HOA rule about aesthetics. Let's introduce a little context. Let's inform them that the reason their electricity bills are so low, the reason they haven't had a single brownout in years, is because of Penhaligon Energy. And that, coincidentally, you own it. Arthur leaned back in his leather chair, the scent of expensive law office mingling with the underlying anxiety churning in his stomach. You think that'll work? They'll see I'm not just some rogue homeowner. Saul chuckled, a dry, rustling sound. They'll see you're not someone to be trifled with. We'll draft a statement. Calm, factual, subtly, devastating. Save it for the end of the meeting. Let Beatrice Kravitz hang herself with her own pettiness. Across town, Sarah Chen sharpened her pencils, the graphite sent a familiar comfort. The Harmony Glades HOA meeting. Usually a snorefest of lawn care complaints and mailbox disputes. But tonight felt different. Something about the vitriol directed at Arthur Penhaligon's solar panels, the hushed whispers she'd overheard at the bakery, told her this was a powder keg waiting to explode. She pictured the headline, Solar Flare at HOA Meeting, Power Company Mogul Unmasked. Maybe. She adjusted her recorder, making sure the batteries were fresh. Meanwhile, in her meticulously organized condo, Beatrice Kravitz surveyed her reflection. Her pearl necklace sat perfectly against her floral dress. She dabbed a final bit of lipstick, a shade she called Triumph Red. Tonight, she would deliver harmony glades from the eyesore that was Arthur Penhaligon's abomination. It wasn't just the solar panels themselves, it was the principle. The audacity. The blatant disregard for the rules. And more than that, it was the way he looked at her, that vaguely amused glint in his eyes that suggested she was nothing more than a gnat buzzing around his head. Tonight, the gnat would sting. She had rallied the troops. The petitions were signed, the arguments rehearsed. She could almost taste victory, a delicate sweetness that lingered on her tongue like fine sherry. She clutched her worn copy of the HOA bylaws, its pages dog-eared and highlighted. Let him try to weasel his way out of this. He would learn that in Harmony Glades, rules were rules, and Beatrice Kravitz was the enforcer. A small, almost imperceptible tremor ran through her hands. No, not fear. Excitement. Yes, that was it. Pure, unadulterated excitement. The power play. The community hall buzzed, a hive of nervous energy. Folding chairs groaned under the weight of anxious residents, their faces illuminated by the harsh fluorescent lights. Sarah Chen, notepad in hand, leaned against the back wall, a seasoned observer ready to chronicle the brewing storm. The air crackled with anticipation, thicker than the humidity clinging to the room. Arthur sat rigidly, his palms slick against his khakis. He could feel Beatrice Kravitz's laser-like gaze boring into him from the head table. Her pursed lips and the steely glint in her eyes screamed victory. Victory that was about to be snatched away. He took a deep breath, the scent of stale coffee and simmering resentment filling his lungs. Mr. Penhaligon, Beatrice's voice sliced through the murmuring crowd. As you are aware, the HOA has received numerous complaints regarding the aesthetically displeasing solar panels on your property. She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. A few heads nodded in agreement, a ripple of disapproval spreading through the room. We have repeatedly requested their removal. As you have failed to comply, we are left with no choice but to pursue legal action. Arthur stood. The scrape of his chair against the linoleum floor echoed through the hall, silencing the remaining whispers. He felt a flicker of stage fright, the room suddenly too hot, too bright. He smoothed down his rumpled shirt and forced a calm he didn't feel. Mrs. Kravitz, members of the board, neighbors, he began, his voice surprisingly steady. I understand your concerns. He pulled a slim, leather-bound folder from his briefcase. However, there seems to be a fundamental misunderstanding at play here. He opened the folder and extracted several documents. These, he said, holding them up, are articles of incorporation, financial statements, and deeds of ownership. He walked towards the table, his steps measured and deliberate. Beatrice frowned, her confidence momentarily faltering. She leaned forward, squinting at the documents he placed before her. The other board members craned their necks, their faces a mixture of confusion and curiosity. Arthur took a step back, allowing the documents to speak for themselves. He watched as Beatrice's eyes scanned the pages, her face slowly morphing from stern determination to stunned disbelief. Her mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. These documents, Arthur continued, his voice now resonating with quiet authority, irrefutably demonstrate that I am the sole owner and CEO of Penhaligon Energy. A collective gasp swept through the room. Sarah Chen's pen flew across her notepad, capturing the unfolding drama. The murmur of the crowd rose in volume, a confused chorus of speculation and surprise. Beatrice Kravitz stared at the documents, her face a mask of mortified shock. The color drained from her cheeks, leaving her looking pale and strangely vulnerable. The other board members looked at each other, their expressions mirroring her stunned silence. The carefully constructed edifice of their authority, their power play, was crumbling before their eyes. Arthur stood, a quiet victor in the stunned silence. The oppressive weight on his chest had lifted. He had revealed his hand, and the game had irrevocably changed. A new dawn for Harmony Glades. Before you vote, just hear me out, Arthur said, his voice resonating in the tense community hall. Beatrice Kravitz, perched at the head of the HOA board table, looked like she'd swallowed a lemon whole. I understand the concerns about aesthetics, I truly do. But innovation shouldn't be punished for not immediately fitting into a preconceived notion of beauty. So, I propose a compromise. He gestured towards the projected images of sleek, low-profile solar panels. We can work together. I'll collaborate with a design firm, at my own expense, to create a modular panel system specifically tailored for Harmony Glades. We'll explore options like integrating textured glass, incorporating earth tone colors that complement our existing architecture, and even experimenting with vine-supporting structures that turn the panels into living walls. A murmur rippled through the room. He saw doubt warring with curiosity on faces that had previously been locked in opposition. Furthermore, Arthur continued, pressing his advantage, I'll offer a substantial discount on these panels to any homeowner in Harmony Glades who wants to adopt them. My aim isn't just to power my own home, but to empower our entire community with sustainable, affordable energy. He paused, letting his words sink in. Beatrice Kravitz's face was a mask of disbelief. He'd taken the wind right out of her sails. Sarah, standing near the back of the room, gave him a subtle nod of encouragement. The glint of sunlight off her glasses was a silent cheer. The vote, when it finally came, was unanimous. Even Beatrice Kravitz, her lips pressed into a thin line, raised her hand in begrudging agreement. Then came the unimaginable, a public apology. Beatrice, with visible discomfort, read a prepared statement acknowledging Arthur's commitment to the community and praising his innovative spirit. The words tasted like ashes in her mouth, but she delivered them nonetheless. Arthur Penhaligon had become a local hero. Later, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and violet, Arthur and Sarah sat on his rooftop, the now approved solar panels gleaming softly behind them. The tension that had hung heavy in the air for weeks had dissipated, replaced by a sense of accomplishment. You were amazing in there, Arthur, Sarah said, leaning back against the warm panels. You completely disarmed them. It wasn't just me, he replied, taking her hand. You were my rock through all of this. And honestly, I just couldn't let them win. Not when there's so much potential to do good. He gazed out at the neighborhood, a new vision forming in his mind. You know, this whole thing has made me realize how much we could achieve if we focused on collaborative, sustainable solutions. Maybe we could start a community garden, or a rainwater harvesting initiative. Sarah smiled, her eyes sparkling with excitement. Or maybe, she said, squeezing his hand, we could help other communities facing similar challenges. Show them that change is possible, even when the odds seem stacked against them. The air buzzed with possibilities, with the promise of a brighter, greener future. A new dawn had broken for Harmony Glades, and Arthur and Sarah were ready to meet it head-on, together.